Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History. Tonight we step out into a world so cold that the air itself feels like it might crack if you move too quickly. You stand on the vast Mongolian steppe in midwinter, the horizon stretching so far that it seems to bend with the earth, and the wind. Oh, the wind slides across the grasslands with nothing to stop it for hundreds of miles. It carries needles of ice that tap gently against your cheeks like nature politely reminding you that you are very small and very warm-blooded. In fact, if you showed up here unprepared, wrapped in your modern city jacket and optimistic attitude, you probably wouldn't survive this. Not for long anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, let me know where you're listening from and what your local time is. I always love seeing how far these quiet journeys travel. Now dim the lights and imagine the camp slowly coming into view. At first it doesn't look like much. A handful of round white structures crouch low against the land, their shapes softened by drifting snow. A few horses stand nearby, tails turned to the wind with the stoic patience of creatures who have seen this weather 1,000 times before. Thin streams of smoke curl upward into a sky so pale blue it almost feels silver. This is not a temporary emergency shelter. This is home deliberately designed, carefully maintained and refined over centuries to endure winters that regularly plunge below -30 degrees Celsius. Modern meteorological records confirm that the Mongolian plateau experiences some of the harshest continental climates on Earth, with extreme swings between scorching summers and ferocious winters. Yet for generations, Mongol families did not merely survive here, they thrived. You walk closer, boots crunching on snow that squeaks with that unmistakable dry, powdery sound of deep cold. The smell of smoke reaches you first earthy, slightly sweet. It's not wood. There are almost no trees out here. Instead, the fire is fueled by dried animal dung meticulously collected and stored during warmer months. It burns slowly and steadily, producing a surprisingly effective heat source in a landscape otherwise devoid of fuel. That detail alone tends to surprise modern visitors, though. Steppe communities understood the value of this resource long before anyone tried to give it a polite scientific name. Some accounts from travellers even note that the smoke from these fires was considered cleaner and more predictable than greenwood. A quirky historical aside mentions that newcomers sometimes spent their first few days as trying unsuccessfully to avoid sitting near such fires, only to become fiercely protective of them once they understood how essential they were. You notice there's no frantic activity in the camp. No one is rushing around dramatically battling the cold. Instead, everything feels measured, calm, almost routine. That's because winter here is not treated as an emergency. It's treated as a season with rules. And the Mongols know those rules intimately. Historians continue to debate exactly how much of this knowledge developed through trial and error versus careful cultural transmission, but what's clear is that survival depended on anticipation, not reaction. Every decision from where to place a shelter to how to tether animals was made with the expectation that winter would arrive, stay longer than anyone wanted and test every weakness. You pause to listen. There's very little sound. The steppe in winter absorbs noise like a blanket. A horse snorts softly. Somewhere leather creaks. The fire murmurs. Compared to modern life with its endless hum of electricity and engines, the quiet feels enormous. And that quiet mattered. Without storms constantly battering forests or cities, Mongols could detect subtle environmental cues, a shift in wind direction, the texture of snow underfoot, even how animals behave before a temperature drop. This sensitivity to surroundings wasn't poetic romanticism, it was practical awareness sharpened by necessity. You duck slightly and step inside one of the round tents, the gur, though many people know it, by the Russian word yurt. Immediately the temperature changes. Not tropical, not even especially warm, but astonishingly less hostile. The air holds a gentle, steady heat that wraps around you like a thick coat. The structure works because of elegant simplicity. A circular lattice wall, layers of felt made from sheep's wool, and an outer covering that blocks wind while allowing the building to breathe. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that variations of these portable dwellings have been used across Inner Asia for at least 3 millennia. Their insulation is so effective that the difference between inside and outside temperatures can feel almost miraculous. You sit and someone hands you a bowl of hot salty milk tea, su te tsai. The taste is unfamiliar if you're used to sugary drinks. It's rich, slightly savoury, deeply warming, more fuel than refreshment. Everything about steppe winter culture leans towards sustaining heat inside the human body. Interestingly, one lesser-known anecdote from early envoys describes visitors being startled by how frequently they were encouraged to drink such tea. Declining was seen not as rudeness, but as a misunderstanding, like refusing gloves in a blizzard. Because here warmth is not a luxury, it is a shared responsibility. The chair's layout reflects that idea. People sit in specific positions, tools arranged within easy reach, movement minimised to conserve heat. Even the door traditionally faces south, away from the harshest northern winds, a small but critical design choice repeated across thousands of camps. You begin to realise something subtle but profound. Mongol winter survival was never about conquering nature, it was about alignment. Instead of resisting the environment, they adjusted their habits, materials and expectations until cold became manageable, still dangerous, still respected, but no longer an unbeatable enemy. Outside, the horses shift again, using their hooves to scrape snow aside and reach the grass beneath. They don't wait for humans to feed them. They are partners in this system as adapted to the cold as the people themselves. And that partnership between human, animal and landscape forms the quiet foundation of everything you're about to experience. The wind presses gently against the walls, but inside the fire continues to glow. No panic, no drama, just practiced endurance repeated year after year, generation after generation. You settle in, listening to the low crackle, feeling warmth slowly return to your fingers, and begin to understand that surviving the coldest winters on Earth was not a single trick or invention. It was a way of life. You sit a little closer to the fire, noticing how no one here seems bundled in the chaotic, bulky way modern winter clothing often forces you to be. There is no frantic layering of synthetic fabrics, no awkward zippers pulled up to the chin. Instead, every garment looks deliberate, almost architectural. Each piece has a role. Each fold holds warmth like a carefully banked ember. The foundation of this system is the deal, the long robe worn by Mongols for centuries and still used today. Historical records from the era of the Mongol Empire describe these garments as standard attire, for men and women alike, designed to function across seasons, but adapted with heavier materials for winter. The deal wraps across the body rather than opening straight down the middle, which prevents wind from slipping inside. It fastens at the side, creating a seal that traps heat close to the torso. You run your hand across the fabric. It is thick, slightly coarse, and surprisingly soft underneath. Wool dominates the inner layers because wool retains warmth even when damp and creates tiny air pockets that act as insulation. Long before laboratory tests explained this property, nomadic herders had already trusted it with their lives. Underneath the outer robe are additional layers, but they are not random. They're arranged so that moisture can move outward while warmth stays in. This prevents sweat from freezing against the skin, which would be far more dangerous than the cold itself. It is a system based on balance, rather than sheer bulk. Some scholars have suggested that this understanding of thermal regulation developed purely through observation of animals, especially sheep and goats, whose winter coats manage both insulation and ventilation. Others caution that we may be oversimplifying and point to the likelihood of gradual experimentation across generations. Historians still argue whether these clothing traditions emerged from deliberate innovation or from countless small adjustments that accumulated over centuries. You notice the sleeves are long enough to cover the hands completely when needed. Gloves exist, of course, often made of fur, but the deal itself can serve as the emergency protection. When temperatures plunge suddenly, a person can tuck their hands inside the robe without interrupting work. Even the belt plays an important role. It is not just there to keep the garment closed. Wrapped tightly around the waist, it helps support the lower back during long hours on horseback and creates a pocket of warmer air in the upper body. Many Mongols carried small tools food or fire starters tucked into this belt, using body heat to keep essential items from freezing. You shift slightly and notice your posture changing as you imagine wearing such clothing. The design encourages upright movement, conserving energy. Modern parkas often make you feel like you're hauling around a sleeping bag. The deal works with the body instead of against it. Fur becomes the outer defense when the cold deepens. Different animals provide different advantages. Sheepskin offers excellent insulation for everyday use. Fox and wolf fur resist frost buildup in harsher conditions. Boots lined with felt and hide create a barrier so effective that travellers once wrote in astonishment about walking across frozen ground for hours without losing sensation in their feet. One curious detail recorded in a 19th century travel diary claims that some herders preferred boots slightly oversized so they could add extra felt layers depending on conditions. It sounds suspiciously like an early version of adjustable winter gear. The difference is that nothing here relied on factory precision. Everything could be repaired, modified or replaced using materials at hand. You glance toward the doorway where a pair of boots rests upside down on a rack. This is not accidental. Turning them prevents frost from collecting inside and allows any trapped moisture to escape. Small habits like this made the difference between comfort and frostbite. There is also the hat. You cannot ignore the hat. Thick fur lined often with ear flaps, it protects the head where heat loss can be significant. Mongol headwear varied by region and tribe, yet all shared the same purpose of conserving warmth, while remaining secure in fierce winds. Riders needed hats that would not blow away during a gallop across open steppe. Mainstream historical evidence shows that Mongol soldiers wore similar layered clothing beneath their armour during the 13th century campaigns. Contrary to the image of lightly dressed warriors racing through snow, they were deeply insulated, allowing them to endure conditions that immobilized opposing armies. You take a sip of the salty tea again, feeling how it complements the clothing rather than replacing it. Warmth here is cumulative. Fabric, fire, food and movement all contribute in small but steady ways. Another unexpected element is colour. Many winter deals were made in darker tones such as deep blue-brown or muted red. While partly aesthetic, darker dyes also absorb more solar radiation during daylight hours, adding a subtle but useful thermal gain. No one on the steppes spoke about absorption coefficients, yet the effect was quietly appreciated. There is something calming about how logical everything feels. No excess, no decoration without function. Even beautiful embroidery often reinforces seams that endure heavy wear. As the fire shifts and settles, you realise these garments are more than clothing. They are portable shelters. Each person carries their own microclimate, a personal buffer against the vast cold outside. And this means survival does not depend entirely on staying indoors. A Mongol dressed for winter can ride herd repair equipment or travel for hours without catastrophic heat loss. Mobility remains possible, which is essential in a land where standing still can be more dangerous than moving. You begin to understand that warmth here is not about fighting winter with brute force. It is about engineering harmony between body and environment using materials drawn directly from the animals and landscapes that surround you. The door flap stirs slightly as someone enters, bringing with them a brief swirl of icy air that fades almost immediately once sealed again. No one reacts, the system works, the layers hold. Outside, the temperature continues its quiet descent, but inside the circle of wool, fur and careful design, the cold is kept patiently at bay. The warmth inside the gyre feels steady now, almost rhythmic, like the slow breathing of the structure itself. You begin to notice how intentional everything is, from the curve of the walls to the placement of the central stove. Nothing here is accidental. The entire shelter is a response to wind cold and the constant need to move without losing protection. From the outside, the gear appears simple. A low circular form white against the snow with a small chimney rising from the centre. Yet this design represents one of the most refined examples of portable architecture ever developed. Archaeological evidence suggests that similar round dwellings were used by steppe nomads as far back as the Bronze Age, evolving gradually into the form still recognisable today. You look up, the roof poles radiate outward from a central ring called the tuno, creating a pattern that resembles the spokes of a wheel. This shape distributes weight evenly and prevents snow from accumulating heavily in one spot. Snow that might crush a flat roof simply slides away here, carried off by the wind. The felt covering is the real secret. Thick layers of compressed sheep's wool wrap around the wooden frame like a massive blanket. Felt is astonishingly effective at trapping air, and trapped air is what holds heat. Even in extreme cold, this insulation keeps the interior far warmer than the outside air. Some researchers have compared the thermal performance of a traditional gyre to modern insulated cabins and found it remarkably efficient, especially considering it uses no synthetic materials. Others caution that such comparisons can be misleading, because nomadic life involved constant maintenance and adjustment of the coverings. Historians still debate how much labour went into sustaining this efficiency, but there is no question that families understood exactly how to manage it. You notice that the walls are not rigid, they flex slightly when the wind presses against them. This flexibility prevents structural damage and allows the gear to absorb gusts that would rattle or crack a more brittle building. It is less like a house and more like a living shell. The door is small on purpose. Every time it opens, less heat escapes. You instinctively duck when passing through, and that small action becomes part of the thermal strategy. Even posture is shaped by winter survival. At the centre, the stove glows with a controlled, patient fire. Fueled by dried dung collected during warmer seasons, it burns with surprising consistency. Travellers in the 13th and 14th centuries often remarked on how steppe communities could maintain indoor warmth without access to forests. One Persian chronicler even expressed amazement that an empire could function in a land he described as nearly treeless. You listen to the fire crackle softly. It produces more of a low hum than a roar, because the goal is endurance, not bursts of heat. Fast-burning fuel would mean constant relighting and wasted energy. This slow combustion keeps temperatures stable through long nights. There is also careful ventilation. The roof ring can be adjusted to release smoke while retaining warmth. Too much ventilation would chill the space, too little would make it unlivable. Managing that balance required experience passed down through families. For honoured guests or elders, while tools and daily items occupy specific areas. This organisation reduces unnecessary movement, which helps conserve heat and energy during winter. You sit along the wall, feeling how the curve of the structure seems to gather warmth around you. Unlike square rooms where heat collects unevenly, the circular shape allows air to circulate gently. There are no corners for cold to hide in. It becomes clear that portability was just as important as insulation. These homes could be dismantled in a matter of hours, loaded onto carts and rebuilt elsewhere. That mobility allowed families to relocate when grazing conditions or weather patterns demanded it. A fixed stone house might sound more secure, but on the steppe it could become a trap if conditions changed. There is an almost modern elegance to the engineering. Lightweight lattice walls collapse inward like an accordion. Roof poles bundle together. Felt layers roll into manageable sections. Everything is designed for transport by animals rather than machines. You imagine the process of setting up camp in winter. The frame rises first quickly assembled by practiced hands. Felt layers follow wrapped tightly to seal gaps. Finally, the stove is lit, transforming a skeletal structure into a pocket of life against the cold. Some scholars have wondered whether this portability contributed to the Mongols' extraordinary military campaigns, allowing entire communities to move efficiently across vast distances. Others suggest the military adapted civilian technology rather than the other way around. The direction of influence remains an open question, one that continues to interest historians studying nomadic logistics. Outside, the wind intensifies, briefly brushing across the go with a soft rushing sound. Inside, you feel almost nothing change. The structure absorbs the disturbance, its layered skin diffusing the force. You realise that this shelter does not try to overpower winter. it negotiates with it. The gear offers just enough resistance to create comfort while remaining flexible enough to survive the season's violence. The fire shifts again. Someone adds another piece of fuel with unhurried precision. No one wastes motion. Every action is measured, calm, deliberate. In a landscape where temperatures can kill within hours, this quiet efficiency becomes a form of wisdom. The gear is not only a house, it is a tool, a strategy, and a companion to those who live within it. And as you sit in its warm circle, you begin to sense how architecture itself became one of the Mongols' greatest defences against the cold. You step back outside for a moment, bracing for the cold that presses in like a physical weight. The air feels sharper now, the kind that makes each breath seem smaller than the last. Yet just a few steps from the gear you see the quiet source of its warmth continuing to solder in a shallow iron stovepipe. This is where survival truly begins, not with roaring bonfires, but with careful fire mastery in a land that offers almost no wood at all. On the Mongolian steppe, trees are rare visitors. Vast stretches of grassland provide fuel for animals, but very little for flames. So nomadic communities developed a solution that at first surprises modern sensibilities. They burn dried dung primarily from horses, sheep, goats and cattle. It is collected during warmer months, shaped by hand and left to dry in the sun till it becomes dense, odourless fuel. Historical observers from as early as the 13th century recorded this practice with fascination. One envoy travelling through Mongol territories noted that caravans carried bundles of dried dung just as carefully as they carried food. To outsiders it seemed unusual, but to steppe families it was as ordinary as stacking firewood beside a cabin. You crouch near a pile prepared for use. The pieces are light, almost fibrous, and surprisingly clean. Once dried, they burn with a steady, even heat and produce less smoke than many types of green wood. The fire is not meant to blaze dramatically, it is meant to last. This slow, controlled burn is essential during winters when relighting a fire repeatedly would waste precious energy and risk exposure to the cold. Instead, embers are preserved overnight, carefully shielded so that morning warmth can be coaxed back to life without starting from nothing. Some environmental historians point out that this fuel system was remarkably sustainable, recycling what animals naturally produced while leaving the fragile grasslands intact. Others question whether heavy reliance on dung may have affected soil nutrients near large encampments. The long-term ecological balance of this practice is still discussed in academic circles. You notice how intentionally the fire is handled. No one tosses fuel carelessly. Each addition is timed, placed, adjusted. Fire here is less about comfort and more about continuity. Losing it during a storm could mean hours of dangerous exposure while trying to reignite warmth. There is even an art to how the fuel is stacked. Pieces are arranged to allow airflow without letting the flame grow too quickly. A fast fire consumes resources. A patient fire protects life. A lesser-known anecdote from Russian travellers describes families carrying small containers of glowing coals when moving camp in winter, ensuring they could restart their hearth immediately upon arrival. Imagine transporting fire across frozen plains like a living heirloom. It gives you a sense of how central this element was. You extend your hands toward the heat, feeling it spread slowly through your fingers. It is not intense, it is persistent. That persistence is what matters in a place where nights can stretch endlessly and temperatures can plunge without warning. Fire also shaped daily routines. Meals were cooked efficiently, tools warmed before use, and water melted gradually rather than in wasteful bursts of heat. Every action revolved around conserving fuel and maintaining balance between warmth and supply. Mainstream historical research confirms that Mongol armies relied on the same methods during winter campaigns. Portable stoves and dung fuel allowed soldiers to travel without dependence on forests, giving them a logistical advantage over opponents who needed timber for survival. This ability to generate heat anywhere on the steppe helped sustain long-range mobility even in freezing conditions. You glance across the camp and see thin columns of smoke rising from several gyrs, each one signalling a carefully managed hearth. The smoke drifts low and slow, never the towering plumes you might expect from large fires. Subtlety again proves more effective than spectacle. There is also a social dimension to these fires. Families gathered close, sharing warmth as well as conversation. Sitting together reduced the amount of fuel needed, since body heat contributed to the overall temperature. The fire became a centre not only of cooking, but of storytelling, planning and quiet endurance. Some anthropologists suggest that this constant proximity strengthened communal bonds during long winters, reinforcing cooperation essential to nomadic survival. Others argue that the harsh environment itself enforced closeness whether people preferred it or not. Either way, the hearth became both practical and symbolic. You notice that ashes are never discarded carelessly. They are saved, sometimes used to help insulate surfaces or manage ice around the camp. Even the remnants of fire have value here. The wind shifts again, carrying a faint warmth mixed with the scent of smoke. It is a reassuring smell, one that tells everyone nearby that the system is working, that heat continues to exist despite the vast cold pressing in from all directions. Standing there, you realise that Mongol winter survival depended not on finding fuel, but on redefining what fuel could be. By turning animal byproducts into energy, they freed themselves from geographic limitations that would have trapped other societies. You take one last look at the glowing stove before stepping back toward the gear, understanding now that every small flame on this frozen steppe represents foresight months in the making, and inside that stored sunlight from summer grass continues to burn, keeping winter at a respectful distance. As you re-enter the gyre, brushing frost from your sleeves, you notice that not all warmth comes from fire or fabric. A large part of survival here is standing just outside, quietly stamping at the snow with calm determination. The horses are feeding. At first glance it seems improbable. The ground is frozen hard enough to ring when struck, yet these compact Mongolian horses lower their heads and scrape through the snow with strong, deliberate hooves. Beneath that white crust lies dry winter grass, preserved by the cold like food in a natural freezer. This ability is one of the greatest advantages nomadic Mongols possessed. Unlike many domesticated breeds that require stored fodder, Mongolian horses can forage year-round, even in severe conditions. Modern zoological studies confirm that they grow exceptionally thick winter coats and develop metabolic adaptations that allow them to conserve energy while enduring extreme temperatures. You step closer, hearing the steady crunch of snow breaking under their hooves. The animals work without panic. They know exactly what to do. Their survival skills are instinctive, refined through centuries of breeding in this harsh environment. Mainstream historical sources describe how these horses enabled the vast mobility of Mongol society, including the famous campaigns of the 13th century. Each rider often managed several mounts rotating between them, so no single horse became exhausted. Even in winter, this system allowed people to travel astonishing distances across frozen terrain. You notice their proportions. They are smaller than many modern riding horses, stockier with thick necks and powerful legs. This build helps them retain heat and maintain balance on icy ground. Their low centre of gravity reduces the risk of slipping, while dense hair protects sensitive skin from biting winds. There is also an almost quiet partnership between humans and animals here. The horses are not stabled in elaborate barns. They remain outside, acclimated to the same environment as their owners. Bringing them into warm enclosures would actually weaken their cold tolerance. Some researchers have suggested that this constant exposure created one of the toughest equine populations on Earth. Others question whether romantic descriptions exaggerate their resilience, noting that severe winters known as dzud could still devastate herds. The exact limits of their endurance remain a subject of ongoing study. You watch a foal press close to its mother, using her body as a shield against the wind. That simple act mirrors what people do inside the gyre. Survival strategies repeat across species. A curious historical tidbit comes from European observers who were astonished that Mongol riders could sleep in the saddle during long journeys, trusting their horses to navigate familiar routes even in poor visibility. Whether fully accurate or slightly embellished, the story reflects the extraordinary level of trust placed in these animals. The relationship goes beyond transportation. Horses provided milk which could be fermented into airag during warmer months, and their dung, as you already saw, became critical winter fuel. In a sense, the animals help generate both food and fire. You run your gloved hand along a horse's flank. The coat feels almost layered with coarse outer hair shedding snow while a dense undercoat traps warmth. Nature's insulation system rivals any human-made garment. This design also allows moisture to escape, preventing ice from forming against the skin. A wet animal in these temperatures would quickly lose heat, so evolution favoured coats that manage both protection and ventilation. The herd shifts slowly as the wind changes direction. They instinctively turn their backs to it, minimising exposed surface area. Mongol herders often mirrored this behaviour when resting outdoors, aligning themselves with the animal's orientation to reduce heat loss. There is a rhythm to this coexistence. Humans depend on horses for mobility and resources. Horses depend on humans for guidance, protection from predators, and selective breeding. Together they form a system capable of enduring winters that would isolate less adapted societies. Historians often emphasise cavalry tactics when discussing Mongols, but the deeper story is logistical. Without these hardy animals, winter travel across the steppe would have been nearly impossible. Armies, trade caravans, and migrating families all relied on equine endurance. You notice that even now no one rushes to interfere with the horses' feeding. The animals manage themselves. That independence reduces the labour humans must expend in the cold, conserving precious energy for other tasks. Snow continues to fall lightly, dusting their backs. Instead of melting, it rests there an additional insulating layer. The horses look almost sculpted from the landscape itself. One anthropologist once remarked that to understand Mongol winter survival, you must see the herd as an extension of the household rather than separate livestock. That observation feels accurate as you stand among them, listening to the quiet tearing of grass beneath snow. Eventually you step back toward the chair again, carrying with you the realization that warmth on the steppe does not come from isolation. It comes from interdependence, from systems where humans, animals, and environment function together. Inside the fire continues its steady glow. Outside, the horses keep digging, tireless and sure, turning frozen ground into sustenance. And between those two circles of life, winter loses much of its power. Back inside, a pot now rests near the stove, giving off a gentle, savoury aroma that feels heavier than the smell of the smoke outside. Winter on the steppe is not a time for delicate flavours or decorative meals. It is a season defined by calories, density, and endurance. You are about to understand that food here functions less like cuisine and more like carefully measured fuel. A bowl is handed to you. Inside is a thick stew made from mutton fat and perhaps a few stored root vegetables if the family has them. The surface glistens slightly. That sheen is not excess, it is survival. Nutritional studies of traditional Mongolian diets show that winter meals were intentionally high in fat and protein. These nutrients digest slowly, releasing energy over long periods and helping the body maintain core temperature. In an environment where burning calories literally keeps you alive, such richness becomes essential rather than indulgent. You take a cautious sip. The taste is simple, almost elemental. Meat, salt, warmth. Nothing distracts from the purpose of sustaining you. Historical accounts from travellers often mention their surprise at how little grain was eaten, compared to agricultural societies. Herding cultures relied primarily on animal products, especially during winter when crops were unavailable. This reliance shaped not only diet, but migration patterns and herd management. Some scholars have argued that this meat-heavy diet contributed to the physical stamina often attributed to Mongol riders. Others suggest the relationship between diet and endurance has been overstated, pointing instead to training and lifestyle. The balance between nutrition and conditioning remains something historians still discuss with interest. You notice that nothing is wasted. Bones are boiled repeatedly to extract every possible nutrient. Fat is rendered and stored. Even small scraps find their way into soups. Efficiency governs every decision. There is also a rhythmic pattern to eating. Instead of frequent snacking, meals tend to be substantial and spaced to align with daily labour. Digestive warmth becomes another layer of insulation, a slow internal fire complementing the stove. A lesser-known detail recorded by ethnographers describes how frozen meat was sometimes sliced thin and eaten after brief warming, almost like a steppe version of preserved jerky. The extreme cold acted as a natural freezer, allowing storage without spoilage. To outsiders, it might seem unusual, but here it was simply practical. You realise that refrigeration, which modern households depend on, existed naturally all around you. The challenge was not keeping food cold, it was managing it so that it could be prepared safely and efficiently. Dairy also plays an important role, though it appears differently than you might expect. Milk collected in warmer seasons was processed into durable forms such as dried curds or hardened cheeses that could last for months. These could be softened in hot liquids when needed, restoring both texture and nourishment. The salty milk tea you tasted earlier now makes more sense. It provides hydration minerals and warmth all at once. The salt helps the body retain water, which is critical in cold climates where dehydration can happen quietly without the obvious cue of sweating. You hear someone ladle more stew into bowls, the motion unhurried, almost meditative. Cooking here is rarely rushed. Rapid boiling wastes fuel. Slow simmering extracts more energy from the same resources. Anthropologists studying nomadic foodways often note that communal meals reduced overall consumption by encouraging sharing rather than individual portions. Others question whether this interpretation reflects cultural values or simply necessity in environments where supplies had to stretch. Either way, eating together conserved both heat and provisions. Outside, the wind hums faintly against the walls, but inside the act of eating creates its own warmth. You can feel it spreading gradually through your chest and hands. There is a lesson in this simplicity. Winter survival depended not on variety but on reliability. Meals were designed to be repeatable with minimal ingredients, ensuring families could sustain themselves even during long periods of isolation. You think about how modern diets chase novelty, while here consistency was comfort. Knowing exactly what each meal provided removed uncertainty, which itself can drain energy in difficult conditions. Another historical observation comes from Chinese chroniclers who described Mongol soldiers carrying dried dairy products on campaigns because they were lightweight yet nutritionally dense. These portable foods allowed armies to remain mobile even when supply lines were thin. The connection between household practice and imperial expansion becomes clearer. What kept a family alive in winter could also sustain a travelling force across continents. You finish the last of the stew noticing how full you feel, despite the absence of spices or elaborate preparation. The satisfaction is physical rather than culinary, like adding another log to a fire. Around you, conversation remains quiet. No one lingers unnecessarily. Energy is conserved movements, deliberate warmth maintained. Here, nourishment is another form of shelter. And as the bowls are set aside and the steady glow of the stove continues, you understand that surviving winter required feeding the body as carefully as tending the flame. The meal finished, you notice that nothing is put away in the casual manner you might expect at home. Every remaining scrap is handled with intention. Storage during a Mongolian winter is not just about keeping food safe. It is about transforming it so that freezing temperatures become an ally rather than a threat. Near the wall of the yir, several small sacks and containers are stacked neatly. Inside them are preserved dairy products prepared months earlier during the abundance of summer. One of the most important is arul dried curds made by boiling milk, separating the solids and allowing them to harden into dense pieces that can last for extraordinary lengths of time. Modern food historians often highlight arul as an ingenious preservation method because it requires no salt, no refrigeration, and no sealed containers. Once dried by wind and sun, the curds become naturally shelf-stable. In winter, they can be eaten as they are or softened in hot tea or soup to restore their texture. You hold one in your hand, it is firm, pale, and surprisingly light. At first it seems too hard to be edible, but after soaking briefly it softens into something both tangy and nourishing. This transformation allows families to carry summer nutrition straight into the coldest months. There is something quietly satisfying about the idea that food prepared under warm skies continues to sustain life when the land turns white. Another preserved staple is butter, sometimes stored in animal skin containers, where it remains usable despite freezing conditions. Fat does not spoil easily in the cold, and it provides an immense amount of energy. Even small amounts added to tea or stew increase the body's ability to resist heat loss. Some scholars have suggested that Mongolian dairy preservation techniques may have influenced neighbouring regions through trade and cultural exchange. Others caution that similar methods developed independently among many pastoral societies. The exact pathways of knowledge transmission remain uncertain, and historians continue to explore how these traditions spread across Inner Asia. You watch as someone retrieves a frozen block of something wrapped in cloth. It is meat that has been stored outside, naturally preserved by the air itself. Instead of thawing it completely, they shave thin slices and add them directly to a pot. This method reduces fuel use while still allowing the food to cook safely. A curious observation recorded by early travellers describes winter camps where entire carcasses were kept frozen upright, almost like wooden posts, until needed. While that image may sound dramatic, the climate certainly made such storage possible. The cold here functions like a vast pantry. Unlike warmer regions where preservation requires constant intervention, the steppe offers a stable, predictable freeze that families learn to manage with remarkable precision. You begin to notice how timing plays a role. Foods are prepared not only for immediate use, but for how they will behave months later. Summer labour echoes into winter survival. This seasonal foresight required deep familiarity with animals and their cycles. Milk production, slaughtering schedules and drying periods were all coordinated so that nothing spoiled and nothing ran out too soon. Anthropologists studying nomadic lifeways often emphasise that such planning replaced the agricultural calendar used by settled societies. Instead of planting and harvesting crops, herders manage flows of animal resources. Others argue that this distinction can be overstated because both systems demanded careful anticipation. Either way, preparation determined whether winter would feel manageable or merciless. You sip more hot tea now enriched with softened curds. The taste is slightly sour but comforting. Each ingredient seems designed to last, to endure, to wait patiently until needed. Even water follows this logic. Snow and ice are collected and melted gradually rather than stored as liquid, since frozen reserves are less vulnerable to contamination. The environment itself becomes a storage technology. A small but telling habit involves hanging certain foods in cloth bags near the roof of the gyre. Their gentle warmth from the stove keeps them from freezing rock hard while still preserving them. It is a delicate balance maintained without thermometers or timers. The more you observe, the clearer it becomes that Mongol winter survival relied on continuity, rather than sudden effort. Families did not scramble once the cold arrived. They entered the season already equipped with months of preserved nourishment. You think about how modern households fill freezers without much thought, while here the freezer was the entire landscape managed through tradition and observation. Outside, the pale light of afternoon begins to fade earlier than you expect. Winter days are short, encouraging people to organise tasks efficiently and retreat indoors before darkness deepens the chill. Inside, the preserved foods rest quietly, each one a stored memory of summer grass, grazing animals and warmer winds. And as you settle back near the stove, you understand that on the Mongolian steppe, survival meant carrying the past forward, transforming fleeting abundance into steady winter strength. Later, when you expect everyone to remain settled inside the warm circle of the gyre, there is movement instead. Saddles are checked, ropes are gathered. A few people prepare to leave camp despite the deepening cold. At first, it seems counterintuitive. Why step out into such conditions if shelter is already secure? Because on the steppe, survival often depends on movement rather than staying still. Nomadic Mongols did not choose their migrations randomly. Winter routes were selected with extraordinary care based on generations of observation about wind exposure, snow depth, and the availability of grazing beneath the surface. Certain valleys collected too much snow and could trap animals. Open ridges might offer easier foraging, but expose travellers to harsher winds. The decision of where to spend winter could determine whether a herd survived. Historical geography studies show that pastoral groups across Mongolia practice seasonal migration patterns known as transhumance, shifting locations several times a year to match environmental conditions. These patterns were not aimless wandering. They were precise strategies refined over centuries. You watch. As riders head out to check grazing grounds, their figures gradually blending into the pale distance. Even short journeys help confirm whether conditions remain stable or if relocation will soon be necessary. Some historians propose that this constant readiness to move gave Mongol society an advantage when forming large-scale networks and armies, since mobility was already embedded in daily life. Others suggest that military expansion later exaggerated what had originally been modest seasonal shifts. The scale of these migrations continues to spark discussion among scholars. Inside the Jia, those who remain reorganize supplies in subtle ways, preparing for the possibility of travel without announcing it outright. Equipment is kept accessible. Loads are balanced in advance. If a sudden storm threatens livestock or blocks grazing, the entire camp can be dismantled with impressive speed. You realize that flexibility is a form of insulation. Instead of building permanent walls against winter, Mongols built routines that allowed them to sidestep its worst effects. A small historical anecdote tells of caravans that deliberately travelled during very cold periods because frozen rivers and marshes became easier to cross. Conditions that immobilized others could open new pathways for those who understood them. You step outside briefly and notice how the landscape feels less like an obstacle and more like a map filled with seasonal instructions. Snowdrifts reveal prevailing winds. The firmness of the ground hints at what lies beneath. Even the behaviour of animals signals whether weather will remain calm. Anthropologists often describe this as environmental literacy, a deep familiarity with subtle changes in terrain and climate. Some scholars argue that calling it literacy risks imposing modern terminology on traditional knowledge, yet the comparison helps explain how much information people could gather simply by observing their surroundings. Movement also helped conserve resources. Remaining too long in one place could exhaust nearby grazing, forcing animals to dig deeper through snow and lose energy. By relocating before conditions worsened, families protected the health of their herds and reduced the risk of starvation. You see returning riders now bringing news that will guide the next decisions. Conversations remain measured. No one dramatizes the cold. They discuss distances, snow cover and animal condition in the same tone someone elsewhere might discuss traffic or weather forecasts. There is comfort in this practicality. Winter is not treated as an enemy to defeat, but as a factor to navigate. Even the construction of the Jia reflects this philosophy. Its portability ensures that no family becomes trapped by attachment to a single location. Home is where conditions allow life to continue. You imagine the quiet efficiency of an entire camp packing before dawn. Lattice frames collapse, felt coverings are rolled, household items are secured onto carts pulled by animals accustomed to the task. Within hours, what looked like a permanent settlement becomes open steppe again. Mainstream historical accounts of Mongol campaigns describe similar scenes on a much larger scale where entire armies could relocate swiftly without losing cohesion. The same skills used by families ensured that soldiers could operate in environments others considered impassable. A curious detail from travel writings mentions that even dogs accompanying the camps learned migration rhythms, moving instinctively with herds and wagons. Every living part of the community adapted to motion as a normal state. As evening settles, the riders finish their reports and the camp relaxes, once more reassured that relocation is not yet necessary. Still, the readiness remains like a packed bag waiting quietly by the door. You return to the warmth inside, understanding now that survival on the frozen steppe was never about enduring cold in one fixed place. It was about knowing when to stay, when to move, and how to carry life with you wherever you went. And in that balance between shelter and motion, the Mongols found a way to live through winters that might otherwise have stopped them entirely. Night approaches with a slow blue dimming of the sky, and you notice that people step outside more often now, not less. They are watching, not staring idly into the distance, but studying the horizon, the clouds, even the behaviour of the animals. On the steppe, Predicting weather is as critical as clothing or shelter. Without instruments, thermometers, or satellite forecasts, Mongol herders relied on careful observation passed down through generations. Certain cloud formations signalled approaching snow. A sudden stillness in the air could mean a storm gathering strength beyond the horizon. Even the way frost formed on the ground offered clues about overnight temperatures. Modern climatologists have confirmed that rapid weather changes are common in Mongolia's continental climate, where clear skies can give way to fierce blizzards within hours. This unpredictability made environmental awareness essential. Missing a warning sign could leave herds exposed or travellers stranded. You follow someone's gaze toward the west, where a faint halo surrounds the moon. That glow, you're told, often indicates ice crystals in the upper atmosphere, and the possibility of incoming snow. It's not superstition, but accumulated experience shaped by countless winters. Some historians suggest that steppe communities developed one of the most detailed oral traditions of weather knowledge in the pre-modern world. Others caution that we must be careful not to romanticize this expertise, noting that even skilled observers could not prevent disasters entirely. The reliability of traditional forecasting remains a topic scholars continue to explore. You listen as quiet discussions unfold. There is no dramatic announcement, just shared interpretation. People compare what they see with what they remember from previous seasons. Memory functions as a living archive. Animals contribute their own signals. Horses bunch together more tightly when severe cold is coming. Dogs grow restless before storms. Even livestock grazing patterns can hint at pressure changes in the atmosphere. A small but fascinating detail recorded by ethnographers describes herders tossing handfuls of snow into the air to watch how it falls. The speed and direction of the drifting crystals help them judge wind strength at different heights. It is a simple act, yet full of information. You try it yourself, releasing a small spray of powder. The flakes scatter quickly, vanishing into the dusk. Even that brief motion tells a story about currents you cannot see. This constant reading of the environment shaped decision-making at every level. Camps were positioned to avoid prevailing winds. Travel was timed to exploit stable weather windows. Herd movements adjusted to avoid ice crusts that animals could not break through. Mainstream historical sources indicate that Mongol military leaders applied similar observational skills when planning winter maneuvers. Understanding wind direction and snowfall patterns allowed them to move forces with surprising precision, sometimes catching opponents unprepared. You begin to realize that knowledge itself was a form of protection as valuable as fur or fire. Inside the gyre, someone marks observations quietly in conversation, not on paper, but through repetition and storytelling. These spoken records ensured that lessons survived even without written systems. Anthropologists often describe this as experiential science, though some scholars argue that labeling it science risks overlooking its cultural and spiritual dimensions. Regardless of terminology, the results were practical and often life-saving. The air grows colder now, the kind of cold that sharpens sound. You hear the faint creak of snow, shifting in the distant snort of a horse. Each noise feels amplified as though winter itself is listening. People return indoors, gradually satisfied that tonight's weather will remain manageable. The storm, if it comes, will wait. That knowledge allows rest, and rest conserves energy. You sit again near the stove, appreciating how much effort goes into understanding conditions you might otherwise ignore. Modern life often shields you from the need to notice such details. Here, awareness replaces technology. A historical anecdote tells of travellers who ignored local advice about an approaching storm and paid dearly for their confidence. Stories like that became cautionary tales, reminding us that humility toward nature was part of survival. The fire glows steadily as the last light fades. Outside the steppe stretches silent and immense, but no longer unknowable. It has been read, interpreted, and respected. And as you settle into the evening calm, you understand that winter could be endured not only through physical preparation, but through careful attention to the language of the land itself. The night deepens, and inside the gear the space feels smaller, though nothing has moved. People sit closer together now, not out of necessity alone, but out of habit shaped by generations. Winter on the steppe is endured collectively. Warmth is something shared. You notice how seating is arranged with quiet efficiency. Elders and guests occupy places of honour farther from the draught of the door, while those who rise frequently sit nearer the entrance. This pattern reduces the amount of cold air reaching the centre each time someone steps outside. Even social structure has a thermal logic. Anthropological research into nomadic households has shown that communal living significantly reduced fuel consumption during harsh seasons. A single heated space required far less energy than multiple smaller shelters. Some scholars interpret this as evidence that environmental pressure reinforced already strong kinship bonds. Others argue that close family organisation existed long before these climatic adaptations. The exact balance between culture and necessity remains open to interpretation. You feel the presence of others as a kind of insulation. Body heat accumulates subtly, adding to the steady warmth from the stove. Blankets and robes overlap, movement slows, conversation settles into a low murmur. Historically, Mongol families often included several generations living together, especially during winter encampments. This arrangement allowed labour to be shared. Younger members handled physically demanding outdoor tasks, while elders contributed knowledge, childcare and craft work indoors. The structure ensured that no one person exhausted themselves in the cold. A fascinating detail from early travellers notes how visitors were sometimes surprised by the lack of strict privacy within these spaces. Life unfolded communally, yet social etiquette created invisible boundaries of respect. People learned to rest, work and sleep within arm's reach of one another, without friction. You hear someone begin telling a story. The tone is calm, almost rhythmic, matching the crackle of the fire. Storytelling served more than entertainment. It kept minds engaged during long winter nights when darkness arrived early and lingered. Psychologists studying traditional societies suggest that such shared narratives helped reduce stress in extreme environments. Others caution against applying modern psychological frameworks too freely to historical contexts. Even so, it is easy to sense how familiar voices could steady emotions when the world outside felt vast and unforgiving. You notice small tasks continuing quietly. A strap is repaired, a tool is adjusted, clothing is inspected for wear. These minor acts prevent larger problems later. Winter maintenance happens continuously rather than in sudden bursts of effort. Mainstream historical accounts emphasize that Mongol resilience came not only from dramatic feats of endurance, but from this constant attention to detail. A loose seam or damaged harness could become dangerous if ignored. Someone passes round more hot tea and the simple act of sharing reinforces connection. Hands warm against the bowl, then against sleeves, then return to stillness. The cycle repeats gentle and unhurried. There is also music sometimes. A low humming, perhaps the sound of a morinkur, played softly its tones, carrying images of wind and open land. Even when instruments were not present, singing filled the same role, creating continuity between people and place. A lesser-known anecdote describes winter evenings where families recited genealogies aloud, reinforcing identity and memory while passing time. Remembering ancestors was not only cultural pride, it reminded listeners that countless others had endured the same winters and survived. You lean back slightly, feeling the layered warmth of shared presence. Outside, the cold remains absolute, but inside it is diffused by cooperation. Some historians argue that this social cohesion later enabled the rapid organisation of Mongol military units, since individuals were already accustomed to coordinated living. Others believe the demands of empire reshaped these relationships in new ways. The debate continues, but the roots clearly lie in everyday practices like this one. The fire settles lower, yet no one rushes to feed it. Heat lingers in felt walls and clothing in the gathered group itself. Efficiency again replaces urgent. You realise that isolation would have been far more dangerous than cold. Alone, a person would burn fuel faster, work harder, and face the psychological weight of endless winter nights. Together, each individual's effort becomes lighter. The conversation fades into comfortable silence. Not emptiness, but a shared pause like the landscape resting under snow. And as you sit within that quiet circle, you understand that Mongol winter survival depended as much on community as on material skill. Warmth flowed not only from wire, but from proximity cooperation and the steady reassurance that no one faced the season alone. Morning comes slowly, not with a burst of sunlight, but with a gradual lifting of darkness into a pale grey glow. You might expect people to linger under blankets for as long as possible, yet activity begins early. Even children are awake already, pulling on small versions of the same layered clothing you saw the night before. Winter here is not something the young are shielded from. It is something they are introduced to carefully, steadily, and with intention. From an early age, Mongol children learned how to function in cold conditions through gradual exposure. Ethnographic studies show that rather than keeping the young constantly indoors, families allowed them to accompany daily routines in short intervals, building tolerance over time. This process strengthened both physical resilience and practical understanding. You watch a child step outside with an adult, their face mostly hidden inside a fur-lined hood. They do not stay long, just enough to help with a small task, then back inside to warm up. These repeated experiences teach awareness without overwhelming the body. Some historians suggest that this method created generations who saw winter not as an interruption, but as a normal part of life. Others caution that survival pressures left little choice in the matter, and that what appears as training may have been simple necessity. The interpretation varies, but the outcome is clear. Knowledge passed through action rather than instruction alone. Inside the Jia, children also learned essential indoor skills during the colder months. They practiced repairing tack, preparing food, and organising supplies. Winter became a season of education where movement slowed enough to allow careful teaching. A curious detail noted by researchers is that games themselves often carried practical lessons. Children might compete to tie knots quickly, or identify animal tracks in the snow. Play and preparation blended together so naturally that the boundary between them nearly disappeared. You imagine how different this feels from modern childhood, where seasons change mostly outside windows rather than shaping daily responsibility. Mainstream historical accounts of Mongol society emphasize that even future warriors began life immersed in pastoral tasks. Riding, herding, and handling animals were introduced gradually, ensuring that by adolescence most individuals already possessed the skills necessary to survive independently in harsh environments. You step outside again and notice a group of youngsters helping guide animals toward a better grazing patch. Their movements are deliberate but not hurried. Adults remain nearby, offering quiet guidance. This shared labour reduces the burden on everyone else. It also ensures that knowledge is never concentrated in only one generation. If winter claimed experienced elders, younger members could still carry on essential practices. Some scholars interpret this as a decentralized survival system where competence was distributed widely across the community. Others debate whether this distribution was intentional planning or simply the natural outcome of nomadic life. The discussion continues among historians studying resilience in pre-modern societies. You hear laughter quick and bright in the cold air. Even here there is room for moments of lightness. Psychological endurance mattered as much as physical adaptation. An anecdote recorded by a 20th century observer describes children racing across frozen ground with astonishing agility, their heavy clothing somehow never slowing them. The observer admitted trying to keep up and failing completely, a reminder that familiarity with environment can outweigh strength alone. Back inside, one of the elders demonstrates how to mend a tear in a felt covering. A child watches closely, then repeats the action under supervision. Every repair skill learned now prevents heat loss later. Even small hands contribute to maintaining the Jia's protective shell. You realise that winter becomes a classroom without walls, its lessons carried through repetition rather than lectures. The stove crackles gently as another piece of fuel is added. Someone checks the thickness of the felt layers near the entrance. A young helper holds the material steady, already understanding its importance. Historians often note that Mongol success across vast territories relied on this continuity of knowledge. Skills were not written down in manuals, but embedded in everyday practice, making them harder to lose. There is also humility in this system. Each generation inherits methods proven by survival, rather than invention for its own sake. Innovation happens, but always within the boundaries of what works. Outside, the sun finally edges above the horizon, casting a faint golden light across the snow. Children step into it confidently, already part of the rhythm that sustains life here. And as you watch them move between warmth and cold with growing ease, you understand that surviving the harshest winters required more than technology or strategy. It required teaching each new generation how to live within winter, rather than fear it. As the day settles into its quiet rhythm, you begin to notice the extraordinary variety of animal skins and furs in use throughout the camp. At first, they seem interchangeable, simply warm coverings against the cold. But the longer you observe, the clearer it becomes that each material is chosen with precision matched to specific needs and conditions. A herder adjusts a heavy sheepskin coat before stepping outside. Another person pulls on boots lined with felted wool and reinforced with hide. Near the doorway hangs a fox fur hat reserved for the harshest winds. These are not fashion choices. They are adaptive technologies refined long before synthetic fabrics existed. Historical evidence shows that pastoral societies across Inner Asia relied extensively on animal skins, but Mongols developed particularly nuanced uses for different types of fur. Sheep provided thick insulation suitable for everyday wear. Goat hair offered durability and resistance to moisture. Wolf and fox fur were valued for outer layers because their long guard hairs shed frost and snow effectively. You reach out to touch a hanging coat. The outer fibres feel slightly coarse, designed to repel ice, while the inner surface is soft and dense, trapping warmth close to the body. This dual structure mirrors the natural winter coats of the animals themselves. Some material culture specialists have suggested that Mongol clothing represents a direct imitation of biological adaptation, essentially borrowing solutions already perfected by nature. Others argue that calling it imitation understates the creativity involved in processing sewing and combining these materials into functional garments. The relationship between observation and innovation remains an active topic among historians. Boots are particularly impressive. Thick soles insulate against frozen ground, while flexible uppers allow riders to maintain control in the saddle. Modern analyses of surviving examples reveal layers of felt compressed so tightly that they function almost like modern insulation panels. A small but intriguing historical note mentions that certain furs were worn with the hair facing inward during extreme cold, maximizing heat retention, then reversed when conditions softened. This reversible use extended the versatility of a single garment. Inside, the jia hides also serve structural roles. They reinforce door flaps, cushion sleeping areas, and create additional wind barriers. Nothing from the animal is wasted. Each part contributes to the overall system of winter survival. You notice someone carefully brushing frost from a fur cloak rather than shaking it violently. Gentle maintenance prevents damage to the fibres, preserving their insulating properties over many seasons. Anthropologists studying nomadic craftsmanship often highlight how these skills required intimate knowledge of animal behaviour, seasonal cycles and tanning processes. Others caution that much of this expertise was so commonplace within the culture that it left little written documentation, making reconstruction difficult. What we know comes largely from observation and surviving artifacts. The smell of treated leather and wool mingles faintly with the smoke from the stove, creating an atmosphere that feels grounded, organic, entirely tied to the surrounding herds. Mainstream historical records confirm that Mongol warriors wore similar materials beneath their armour, allowing them to campaign in climates that immobilize less prepared forces. These layers acted as both padding and insulation, blending civilian practice with military necessity. You begin to understand that technology here is measured not by complexity, but by reliability. Animal skins required no factories, no imported supplies. Everything could be sourced, prepared and repaired locally. Another curious detail recorded by travellers is that clothing was often intentionally oversized, allowing air pockets to form between layers. That trapped air acted as an additional buffer against the cold. Modern mountaineering gear uses the same principle though, with lighter materials. You sit down on a thick hide laid across the floor and feel how it separates you from the frozen earth beneath the gear. Even this simple barrier plays a role in conserving heat. Some scholars have explored whether trade introduced new materials that gradually supplemented traditional furs. Silk, for example, occasionally appeared as an inner lining among wealthier families. Yet debates continue over how widespread such additions were and whether they significantly changed everyday winter life. Outside, the wind rises briefly, but inside, the layered materials absorb the sound as well as the cold. The gear feels wrapped not only in felt but in generations of accumulated knowledge. You realise that every hide represents a connection between animal husbandry and human survival. The same herds that provided food and fuel also supplied the very insulation that made winter livable. And as you run your hand once more across the textured surface of a coat, you see clearly that Mongol adaptation to winter was not built from abstract ideas. It was stitched, tanned, and worn one carefully chosen skin at a time. Later in the afternoon, you notice something surprising. Snow, which at first seemed like nothing but an obstacle, is being gathered deliberately and piled along parts of the gear's outer wall. Instead of clearing it away, people are adding to it. On the steppe, snow is not only endured, it is used. Packed snow acts as an additional insulating layer, blocking wind that might otherwise creep beneath the felt coverings. By building low drifts around the base of the structure, families create a natural barrier that helps stabilise interior temperatures. Modern thermal studies confirm that compacted snow contains trapped air, which makes it an effective insulator despite its icy nature. You watch as someone presses the snow firmly into place with a wooden tool, shaping it almost like clay. The process is calm and methodical, turning what looks like winter's burden into another protective wall. Historical descriptions of nomadic camps occasionally mention this technique, though it was so ordinary that chroniclers rarely paused to explain it. To them, it was simply part of winter routine. Snow also provides the most reliable source of water during freezing months. Rather than searching for flowing streams that may be locked beneath ice, families collect clean snow and melt it slowly over the stove. The gradual melting conserves fuel and ensures a steady supply without overheating the interior. Some environmental historians argue that this reliance on snow reduced the need for permanent water infrastructure, allowing camps to remain mobile even in deep winter. Others question whether snow alone could meet all needs and suggest that ice cutting from frozen rivers also played a role. The balance between these methods is still discussed in research on steppe survival strategies. You pick up a handful yourself. It is dry and powdery, more like fine sand than the heavy snow you may know elsewhere. This texture is typical of Mongolia's cold climate, where low humidity produces lighter flakes that compress easily. A curious detail recorded by travellers describes how experienced herders could judge temperature by the sound snow made underfoot. A sharp squeak indicated very low temperatures, while softer crunching suggested milder conditions. It is a sensory thermometer requiring no instruments. Inside the gear, a pot now contains slowly melting snow turning into clear water. Nothing is rushed. Rapid boiling would waste heat and increase condensation. Instead, the transformation from ice to liquid happens gradually, blending into the rhythm of daily life. You realise that snow performs multiple roles at once. It insulates shelters, supplies, water reflects sunlight during the day, and even preserves food stored outside. What might seem like an overwhelming force becomes with understanding a versatile resource. Mainstream historical climate research shows that regions of Mongolia can maintain snow cover for extended periods without the heavy accumulation seen in forested zones. This lighter but persistent layer was ideal for grazing animals that could dig through it, while still benefiting from its insulating properties. You step back outside and see how the white landscape amplifies light, making the afternoon feel brighter, despite the low sun. That reflected light helps warm dark surfaces slightly, a small but welcome effect during short winter days. Anthropologists often describe nomadic adaptation as a process of reframing environmental challenges into usable elements. Some scholars caution that this phrasing risks sounding too deliberate, reminding us that such practices evolved gradually rather than through conscious design. Still, the ingenuity is undeniable. You notice children helping shape the snowbanks, turning the work into something almost playful, while still contributing to the camp's protection. Their laughter drifts across the open space, briefly interrupting the quiet. Another historical observation tells of travellers who underestimated the usefulness of snow and attempted to clear it away entirely, only to find their shelters colder as a result. Experience taught what instinct alone might miss. The wind sweeps across the steppe again, but the packed snow holds firm, forming a low pale shield around the gyre. Inside, warmth remains steady. Standing there, you begin to see winter not as an adversary pressing inward, but as a material that can be shaped, gathered and understood. Snow becomes part of the architecture, part of the water supply, part of the rhythm that sustains life. And as the light begins its slow descent toward evening, the white ground around you no longer looks empty. It looks purposeful, quietly working alongside the people who know how to use it. As darkness returns and the cold sharpens once more, attention shifts toward one of the most delicate challenges of steppe winter life. Sleep. Rest is essential, yet lying still in such temperatures can allow warmth to slip away faster than during activity. The way people sleep here is carefully arranged to conserve every possible degree of heat. Inside, the gear bedding is brought out in layers. Thick felt mats are placed directly on the floor, first creating a barrier between bodies and the frozen ground beneath. Animal hides are spread over these mats, fur facing upward to trap warmth. Blankets follow, each one tucked with surprising precision rather than draped loosely. Historical accounts from travellers often remark on how structured these sleeping arrangements appeared. Families did not scatter randomly. Positions were intentional, forming a pattern that allowed shared warmth while avoiding drafts from the entrance. You are guided to lie down along the curved wall where heat circulates more evenly. The circular design of the gear prevents cold pockets from forming, making the perimeter a stable place to rest. Elders or young children are often placed between adults, benefiting from additional body heat. Some anthropologists describe this as a thermal community where sleeping bodies collectively function like a single heat source. Others suggest that closeness was simply practical in limited space, and that its insulating benefit may have been recognized gradually. The interpretation varies, but the effectiveness is clear the moment you settle in. Boots are not left randomly by the door. They are placed upside down or near gentle warmth so they will not freeze solid by morning. Clothing needed for the next day may even be kept close to the body overnight, preventing the shock of pulling on icy garments at dawn. You notice that no one undresses completely. Layers remain on loosened slightly, but never removed entirely. This allows quick movement if needed and maintains a consistent temperature through the night. A small yet fascinating detail recorded in ethnographic studies mentions that some families warmed stones near the stove and wrapped them in cloth to place at the foot of bedding. The stones released heat, slowly acting like natural warming devices long before anything resembling a hot water bottle existed. The stove itself is managed carefully before sleep. It is not allowed to burn out, but neither is it fed heavily. A modest sustained glow is preferred, enough to maintain background warmth without consuming too much fuel. Mainstream historical research confirms that managing overnight fires was considered a critical responsibility, often assigned in turns so someone remained alert to adjust fuel if needed. This shared vigilance prevented dangerous drops in temperature. You listen to the quiet, settling sounds of the gear as people arrange themselves. Fabric rustles. A log shifts softly in the stove. Outside, the wind moves like a distant tide across the open land. Historians sometimes debate how well such arrangements protected against the most extreme cold, especially during unusually harsh years. While evidence shows these methods were effective in ordinary winters, severe climate events could still test even the best preparations. That uncertainty kept routines disciplined and consistent. Breathing slows around you. The air inside feels neither warm nor cold, but balanced, held in a narrow range that allows sleep without discomfort. You realize how much knowledge is embedded in these simple actions. The placement of a blanket, the orientation of a bedroll, the decision to share space rather than isolate. Each choice contributes to survival in ways that might go unnoticed elsewhere. Another historical anecdote describes travellers who initially resisted sleeping so closely together, only to discover by morning that they had rested more comfortably than expected. Warmth, like many aspects of steppe life, was communal. The curved roof poles above seem to cradle the space, and faint orange light from the stove flickers across them. It feels less like lying inside a building and more like resting within a carefully tended cocoon. Gradually the sounds diminish. The camp grows still. Outside, the temperature continues to fall, yet within this layered arrangement of felt fur and shared presence, the cold is held at bay. And as you close your eyes, you understand that even sleep on the Mongolian steppe was designed with intention, turning vulnerability into another quiet form of resilience. Before dawn fully arrives, there is already movement again. Winter travel prefers these early hours when the snow surface is firm and easier for animals to cross. You step outside into a landscape that looks almost unchanged, yet those who live here read it like a familiar map. Landmarks that guide travel are rarely dramatic, a low ridge, a cluster of darker grass, the curve of a distant hill. In summer they might appear obvious, but under snow they become subtle variations in colour and shadow. Mongol herders memorise these features over years of seasonal movement, allowing them to navigate even when paths vanished. Historical sources from neighbouring civilizations often expressed amazement at how steppe riders could traverse enormous distances without written maps. Their knowledge was stored, mentally reinforced by repeated journeys along established migration routes. You follow a rider preparing to check part of the grazing range. There are no signposts, yet he moves with confidence, orienting himself by the slope of the land and the direction of the wind. In a place where storms could erase tracks within minutes, memory served as the most reliable guide. Some historians propose that this deep familiarity with terrain contributed directly to the strategic successes of Mongol armies, whose commanders could coordinate movements across vast areas with remarkable accuracy. Others caution that military logistics involved additional planning structures we do not fully understand. The relationship between pastoral navigation and imperial strategy remains a subject of debate. The snow itself contains information. Hard-packed areas suggest wind exposure, while softer drifts indicate sheltered ground where animals might struggle to feed. You learn to look not only at the surface, but at how light reflects differently across it. A lesser-known observation from travellers describes herders using the stars during long winter nights to maintain orientation, combining celestial cues with knowledge of landforms. This blend of astronomy and geography required no instruments, only clear skies and practiced attention. As you walk, the cold air feels sharper than yesterday, yet the pace remains steady rather than rushed. Efficient travel conserved strength. Every unnecessary step wastes energy that the body must replace with precious calories. Mainstream environmental studies confirm that steppe nomads often selected routes that minimized elevation changes, allowing animals to maintain endurance over long distances. Even small hills could become exhausting obstacles when covered in ice. You notice how riders adjust their course slightly to avoid a patch of crusted snow. Beneath such surfaces, grazing becomes difficult and hooves can slip. These decisions happen almost instinctively, guided by experience rather than calculation. Anthropologists studying nomadic orientation sometimes describe it as a landscape memory system where routes are remembered through stories, seasonal markers, and shared teaching. Others argue that this concept risks sounding overly abstract and that practical repetition alone explains the skill. Regardless of terminology, the outcome is extraordinary navigational accuracy. The horizon appears endless, yet it is not empty. Every contour holds meaning for those who know how to see it. You pause and look back toward the camp, now a small cluster against the white expanse. From a distance it seems fragile, but you understand how deliberately it has been placed within this environment. Travel in winter also reinforced communication between scattered groups. Families checked on one another, exchanged news, and ensured herds remained healthy. Mobility sustained social networks just as much as it supported grazing. Another historical detail comes from accounts of relay riding during the Mongol Empire. where messengers crossed immense distances using fresh horses at intervals. These systems functioned even in cold seasons, demonstrating how winter travel was integrated into larger patterns of exchange. The wind carries a faint crystalline sound across the snow as you continue walking. It is neither silent nor loud, just a constant presence accompanying every journey. Eventually you turn back toward the Gyre, retracing steps that would be invisible to an untrained eye. The rider beside you seems unconcerned about losing direction. The land itself provides reassurance. You begin to understand that surviving winter required not only warmth and food, but the confidence to move across a landscape that others might find disorienting or hostile. And as the camp grows nearer once more, you see how knowledge of place transformed the frozen steppe into something navigable, familiar, almost like an extension of home. As the afternoon light fades again into that soft silver glow unique to winter, on the steppe activity slows in a different way. Physical tasks become fewer, yet the camp does not fall into silence. Instead, another form of endurance takes shape, one that has nothing to do with clothing or shelter, and everything to do with the mind. Long winters test patience as much as they test the body. Inside the gear, conversation drifts easily between storytelling, humour and memory. These exchanges are not idle distractions. They help mark time in a season when days can feel indistinguishable from one another. Maintaining a sense of rhythm and meaning becomes essential when the landscape offers few visual changes. Historical descriptions of Mongol life often mention evening gatherings filled with tales of ancestors, journeys and animals. Such storytelling reinforced shared identity while keeping listeners alert and engaged during long nights. It was a cultural habit, but also a psychological strategy. You listen as someone recounts a familiar narrative one told many times before. The repetition is comforting rather than dull. Each telling connects present listeners to those who endured previous winters under similar skies. Some scholars interpret these traditions as mechanisms for emotional resilience, helping communities manage isolation and uncertainty. Others caution against viewing them through modern psychological frameworks, suggesting that storytelling simply reflected long-standing oral culture. Even so, it clearly provided stability in an environment where monotony could weigh heavily. You notice laughter punctuating the stories. Gentle humour appears, often usually centred on animals behaving stubbornly or travellers making avoidable mistakes. Humour lightens the atmosphere without breaking its calm tone. A small but intriguing detail recorded by ethnographers describes winter riddle games played among families, challenging memory and wit while people yawned indoors. These games required no equipment and helped sharpen attention, which was valuable in a landscape where awareness could prevent danger. Outside, the cold continues without pause, yet inside time feels structured by voices rather than by clocks. Mainstream historical research shows that Mongol leaders also relied heavily on oral communication to transmit orders and preserve history. This reliance on spoken tradition meant that memory skills were highly valued across all levels of society. You realise that the same mental discipline used to remember migration routes or weather signs also sustained cultural knowledge during months when written records might be impractical. The fire glows steadily as someone adjusts it, not hurriedly, but with practiced ease. Even these small gestures contribute to a sense of continuity. Routine becomes reassuring. Anthropologists studying nomadic societies often emphasize how seasonal cycles shaped emotional life, encouraging adaptability rather than resistance to change. Others argue that this perspective risks portraying hardship too gently, reminding us that winter could still bring anxiety and loss. Both views acknowledge the importance of mental resilience alongside physical preparation. You find yourself listening more closely to the cadence of speech, noticing how voices remain calm and measured, rarely raised. In such an environment, conserving energy extends even to conversation. Another historical anecdote tells of travellers who initially mistook this quiet tone for solemnity, only to discover it reflected comfort rather than sadness. Contentment did not require loud expression. Gradually, the stories slow, giving way to longer pauses. People settle into tasks that require little movement, like braiding rope or inspecting harness pieces. Hands stay busy while minds remain relaxed. You sense how this balance protects against both boredom and exhaustion. Too much activity would waste calories. Too little engagement might dull alertness. The middle ground allows winter to pass without strain. The gear's interior grows warmer again as bodies gather closer, reinforcing that subtle circle of shared heat you have felt since arriving. You begin to understand that surviving the coldest winters was not only a matter of managing the environment, but also of maintaining inner steadiness. Calm routines, familiar stories and shared laughter formed an invisible layer of protection as vital as felt walls or fur coats. Outside, stars emerge sharply in the clear sky, brilliant in the dry air. Inside, voices fade to murmurs. And in that quiet space between activity and rest, endurance becomes something gentle, carried forward by memory and companionship rather than force. In the days that follow, you begin to notice signs that this winter world is not as isolated as it first appeared. Tracks sometimes approach from distant horizons. Riders arrive, exchange goods or news, and depart again, their visits brief but purposeful. Even in the coldest months, networks of trade continue to move across the steppe. It might seem surprising that commerce persisted in such conditions, yet historical records confirm that Mongol regions maintained active exchange routes year-round whenever weather allowed. Caravans adapted their pace and timing rather than suspending travel entirely. You watch as a visitor unloads bundles wrapped carefully against frost. Inside are items not produced locally. Perhaps tea bricks from china metal tools or bolts of cloth acquired through long-distance connections. In return, the camp offers animal products such as hides, wool or preserved foods. These exchanges reflect a broader pattern. During the era of the Mongol Empire, the vast territory under their influence facilitated trade across Eurasia, connecting regions that had rarely interacted so directly before. Even in quieter times, that legacy of movement remained embedded in steppe life. Some historians suggest that winter travel offered advantages for caravans since frozen ground created firmer routes across areas that might be muddy or impassable in warmer seasons. Others point out the obvious dangers of cold exposure and argue that only experienced groups attempted such journeys. The extent to which winter trade was common is still debated. You notice how visitors are welcomed quickly inside the gyr, both for warmth and for conversation. Information travels alongside goods. News about grazing conditions, distant relatives or shifting weather patterns becomes part of the exchange. A curious historical note comes from accounts describing merchants timing their arrivals to coincide with known migration patterns, ensuring they would meet nomadic groups at predictable locations. This required an understanding of seasonal rhythms similar to that of the herders themselves. The presence of trade reinforces how mobility shaped every aspect of survival. Camps were not isolated units, but nodes in a wider web of relationships stretching across enormous distances. Inside, small items change hands with little ceremony. A repaired tool here, a measure of tea there. Practicality guides each transaction. There is no elaborate marketplace, only mutual need met efficiently. Mainstream economic historians often emphasize that steppe societies contributed significantly to regional exchange by supplying animals, transport and durable materials suited for harsh climates. These contributions helped sustain trade corridors even during challenging seasons. You listen as guests describe conditions elsewhere, their words painting pictures of landscapes you cannot see. Such knowledge allows families to anticipate future moves or prepare for shifts in weather. Anthropologists sometimes describe these interactions as social insurance systems, spreading risk across networks so that no group faced hardship entirely alone. Others caution that alliances could be fragile and influenced by many factors beyond cooperation. The dynamics remain complex. Outside, horses rest briefly before the travellers continue onward. Their breath rises in pale clouds, vanishing quickly into the dry air. You realise that winter did not stop communication. It simply slowed it into a steady, deliberate flow. Movement continued, goods circulated, and information passed quietly from camp to camp. Another anecdote from historical travel narrative describes messengers wrapping written notes in protective coverings and carrying them across snowy plains, trusting both their mounts and their knowledge of terrain. These journeys linked distant communities even when conditions seemed forbidding. As the visitors depart, the camp resumes its familiar rhythm. Yet their presence lingers as a reminder that this place is part of something larger than the horizon suggests. The steppe, though vast, is threaded with invisible pathways shaped by trust, habit, and necessity. And as you return to the warmth of the gear once more, you understand that surviving winter also meant staying connected, ensuring that even in the coldest season, life remained part of an ongoing exchange rather than a solitary struggle. As another stretch of winter days unfolds, you begin to see how the same skills that sustained families also allowed Mongol armies to operate in conditions that others considered impossible. The techniques you have watched in quiet domestic settings once scaled upward into movements of thousands. Contrary to the dramatic image of armies halting when snow fell, Mongol forces often continued campaigns during colder months. Historical chronicles from Persia, China, and Eastern Europe describe mounted units appearing unexpectedly in winter landscapes, travelling swiftly across terrain their adversaries assumed would be impassable. You picture it now. Riders dressed in the same layered deals and furs, mounted on the same resilient horses, carrying preserved foods similar to what you tasted. Military life did not require an entirely separate system because everyday nomadic life already functioned as logistical preparation. Some historians argue that this integration of civilian and military practice was a decisive advantage, allowing Mongol commanders to maintain mobility without constructing elaborate supply chains. Others caution that organised campaigns still required careful coordination and should not be viewed as effortless extensions of pastoral movement. The scale of planning involved remains an area of scholarly debate. Winter itself could become a strategic tool. Frozen rivers turned into solid highways, enabling rapid crossings that would be dangerous or slow in warmer seasons. Snow-covered plains concealed troop movements while also providing reliable water through melting. You step outside and imagine how familiar this environment must have felt to those riders. The same wind, the same pale horizon, the same crunch beneath hooves. For them, winter was not foreign territory, but an extension of home. Mainstream historical sources confirm that Mongol messengers maintained communication lines across vast distances even during harsh weather, using relay systems that allowed fresh horses to carry riders onward without long delays. These networks depended entirely on the endurance of animals and knowledge of winter travel you have already witnessed. Inside the gyre, someone sharpens a blade slowly. The metal warmed first near the stove to prevent brittleness in the cold. Even small practices like this mirrored habits described in military accounts, where equipment had to be handled carefully to avoid damage at low temperatures. A lesser-known detail recorded is in certain chronicles mentioned soldiers sleeping in close formation during winter campaigns, sharing body heat much as families did inside their gyres. The boundary between domestic survival and battlefield adaptation was often thin. You realise that the success of these campaigns cannot be separated from environmental familiarity. Armies accustomed to forests or cities struggled when faced with open, frozen plains. Mongols, by contrast, carried with them systems already proven through generations of winter living. Anthropologists sometimes describe this as ecological alignment, where cultural practices matched environmental demands so closely that expansion into similar climates became feasible. Others question whether this concept oversimplifies the diversity of regions Mongol forces encountered. Even so, their adaptability remains undeniable. The fire crackles softly as tools are returned to their places. Outside, the same conditions that once supported sweeping movements of cavalry now surround our quiet household. You sense how knowledge scaled naturally from family to empire. The ability to ride long distances, preserve food, predict weather, and construct portable shelter allowed military organization to function without abandoning nomadic identity. Another historical anecdote tells of opposing forces underestimating winter conditions, expecting Mongol troops to withdraw only to find them arriving sooner than anticipated. Such surprises reinforce the reputation of Mongol mobility across seasons. You sit back reflecting on how ordinary routines could shape extraordinary outcomes. What you have seen as daily necessity once enabled events that reshaped continents. And as the wind passes over the steppe again unchanged and indifferent, you understand that the same winter that tested endurance also granted opportunity to those who knew how to live within it. Watching these routines repeat day after day, you begin to wonder how different this winter experience would feel for people accustomed to settled agricultural life. The contrast is striking. Nearby farming societies often struggled far more when temperatures dropped this low, even when they lived in regions not nearly as cold as the Mongolian plateau. Agricultural communities depended on fixed fields, stored grain, and permanent buildings. These systems worked well in predictable climates, but could become vulnerable during severe winters. If harvests failed or supply stores dwindled, there was little flexibility to relocate or adjust quickly. Historical comparisons drawn from Chinese and Central Asian records show that sedentary populations sometimes faced famine or isolation when heavy snow blocked roads or froze canals. By contrast, nomadic groups could shift grazing grounds, redistribute herds, and adapt movement patterns to changing conditions. You picture a village rooted to one location, its survival tied to a single harvest months earlier. Then you look at the steppe camp, where animals themselves function as living stores of food and mobility. The difference lies not in strength, but in strategy. Some historians argue that this flexibility gave steppe societies a resilience often underestimated by their settled neighbours. Others caution that nomadic life carried its own risks, especially during extreme weather events that could devastate herds. The debate reminds us that neither system was universally secure. Inside the Jia, daily life continues without visible urgency. The structure can move if necessary. Supplies exist in forms that travel easily. Knowledge resides in memory rather than infrastructure. Mainstream scholarship often emphasizes that misunderstandings between nomadic and agricultural cultures stemmed from these contrasting relationships with land. Farmers measured stability through permanence. Herders measured it through adaptability. A fascinating detail from diplomatic accounts describes envoys from sedentary states expressing confusion at how entire Mongol communities could dismantle their homes and depart within hours. To them, such mobility seemed like instability. To the nomads, it was precisely what ensured continuity. You step outside and look across the open terrain again. There are no walls, no fields, no roads carved permanently into the earth. Yet life persists here with remarkable consistency. Anthropologists sometimes frame this contrast as two different forms of environmental mastery, one based on transforming landscapes through cultivation, the other on moving within them. Others resist that framing, suggesting it risks creating overly neat categories that overlook exchange and overlap between cultures. The cold wind brushes past unchanged by human systems, treating both farmers and herders alike. Only their responses differ. Another historical anecdote tells of travellers who carried seeds across the steppe, hoping to establish farms, only to abandon the attempt after discovering how unpredictable conditions could be. Mobility proved more reliable than rootedness in that environment. You begin to see how Mongol winter survival depended not only on tools and techniques, but on a worldview that accepted movement as natural rather than disruptive. Even time feels different here. Instead of waiting for spring to resume, life activities continue in adjusted form throughout winter. There is no sharp divide between seasons, only shifts in emphasis. Inside, someone repairs harness straps while another checks stored dairy. Tasks align with conditions rather than calendars. Some historians suggest that this seasonal continuity helped Mongol society maintain momentum when interacting with more rigid systems. Others argue that such interpretations oversimplify complex historical encounters. Still, adaptability remains a defining feature. As evening approaches, again the gear glows softly against the snow. It stands as proof that permanence can exist without immobility. And as you step back into its warmth, you understand that surviving the coldest winters required not just physical endurance, but a flexible way of living, one that allowed people to change with the season instead of resisting it. The deeper you settle into this winter world, the more you notice the small habits meant to protect health in conditions where even minor injuries or illness could become serious. Survival is not only about staying warm, it is also about preventing the body from losing strength over long months of cold. Near the stove, someone warms water carefully, not for cooking this time, but for washing hands and face. Cleanliness might seem sedentary in such an environment, yet it plays an important role. Historical accounts and modern studies both note that nomadic groups practiced regular washing when fuel allowed, understanding that skin health and circulation helped prevent cracking, infection, and frost-related damage. You feel the warmth of the water as it is passed around, noticing how quickly people dry their hands afterward to avoid chilling. Even simple hygiene becomes a controlled process. Traditional remedies also appear. Animal fats are sometimes rubbed onto exposed skin to create a barrier against wind. These natural salves helped reduce moisture loss and protect against frostbite. Similar practices are documented across many cold weather cultures, though Mongol herders adapted them using materials readily available from their livestock. Some historians interpret these treatments as early forms of preventative medicine shaped by observation rather than theory. Others question how widespread such practices were and caution that evidence can be fragmentary. The extent of organised health knowledge remains an area of discussion. You watch an elder examine a child's cheeks for signs of overexposure, gently guiding them closer to the fire. Monitoring one another was essential because cold injuries could develop quietly before the person affected realised it. Mainstream historical sources mention that maintaining circulation through regular movement was considered just as important as rest. Sitting completely still for too long risks stiffness and loss of warmth, so even indoor activities involved light motion such as sewing, braiding rope or tending equipment. A small yet interesting anecdote from travellers describes herders massaging their hands and feet before sleep to encourage blood flow, a habit learned through experience rather than formal instruction. You notice how clothing is adjusted frequently, loosened or tightened, depending on activity level. Overheating during work could lead to dampness, which later increased the risk of chilling. Careful regulation prevented this cycle. Anthropologists often describe these routines as forms of embodied knowledge, skills carried in habit rather than explained in words. Others argue that such terminology can sound abstract when the practices themselves were straightforward acts repeated daily. Either way, they contributed quietly to resilience. The diet you observed earlier also supports health. High fat intake provided not only calories but nutrients that sustained energy and helped the body cope with environmental stress. Warm drinks maintained hydration in air so dry that thirst might not be obvious. You step outside briefly and feel the cold tightening your breath again. It becomes clear how easily fatigue could set in without constant attention to these details. Inside tools are checked to ensure they function properly, because broken equipment in winter could delay necessary work and expose people to danger. Maintenance of objects becomes another aspect of maintaining well-being. Historians studying nomadic medicine note that while formal medical systems were limited, practical care focused on prevention, observation, and swift response to problems. This approach aligned closely with the realities of life far from permanent settlements. Another recorded detail mentions the use of herbal infusions gathered during warmer seasons and stored for winter use, providing mild treatments for coughs or fatigue. Such supplies linked summer gathering with cold season health. You realise that survival here depends on constant awareness of the body's condition, just as much as awareness of weather or animals. Nothing is taken for granted. As evening settles once more, people gather again near the stove, adjusting layers, sharing tea, and ensuring everyone feels steady before rest. And in these quiet acts of care repeated day after day, you see how Mongols met winter, not only with strength but with attentiveness, preserving health through habits so ordinary they almost disappear into the rhythm of life. As another clear night settles over the steppe, you notice that attention turns briefly upward. The sky here feels immense, sharper and more crowded with stars than almost anywhere else. In winter, when the air is especially dry and still, the heavens appear close enough to touch. For Mongols, this sky was not just scenery. It carried spiritual meaning tied closely to endurance and survival. Many followed beliefs centered on Tengri, often translated as the eternal blue sky, a vast presence understood to govern fate, weather, and the balance of the world. Historical sources from the Mongol Empire describe leaders invoking Tengri before major decisions, reflecting the world view in which human effort and natural forces were inseparable. Living through harsh winters reinforced this sense of dependence on powers beyond direct control. You step outside and feel the cold pressing in again, yet the act of looking upward creates a strange calm. The same sky stretches over every camp, every herd, every traveller crossing the plains. Some historians argue that this spiritual perspective encouraged resilience by framing hardship as part of a larger cosmic order. Others caution that we must avoid assuming belief automatically translated into comfort, noting that daily survival still required relentless effort. The emotional role of faith remains something scholars continue to examine. Near the entrance of the ger, a small offering is placed quietly, perhaps a gesture of respect to the land or ancestors. Such acts are often simple and personal rather than elaborate rituals. Anthropologists studying steppe traditions have observed that spirituality blended seamlessly with routine life. There was rarely a strict boundary between sacred and practical actions. A journey, a meal, or the care of animals could all carry symbolic meaning. You hear a low murmur of words spoken into the night air, not loud enough to disturb the stillness. It feels less like a ceremony and more like acknowledgement, a moment of connection between people and the environment surrounding them. A curious historical detail appears in several chronicles that describe Mongol leaders consulting shamans during times of unusual weather, seeking guidance when conditions seemed unpredictable. While the accuracy of these reports varies, they suggest that spiritual interpretation accompanied environmental observation. Inside the ger, again, the fire continues its steady glow, yet even here the symbolism of the sky remains present. The circular roof opening frames a patch of darkness filled with stars, a reminder of that larger presence beyond the felt walls. Mainstream historians often note that Mongol cosmology emphasized harmony rather than domination of nature, a perspective reflected in how communities adapted to winter instead of attempting to overpower it. You sit quietly sensing how belief might strengthen patience during long seasons. When survival depends on accepting forces beyond control, resistance gives way to cooperation with the rhythms of climate and land. Some scholars interpret this worldview as an ecological ethic shaped by necessity, while others argue it developed independently and later aligned with nomadic life. The origins remain debated, yet its influence on daily attitudes is clear. Another anecdote from travellers describes how even hardened warriors pause during journeys to acknowledge the sky, before setting out a gesture combining reverence with routine. Outside, the stars remain unwavering silent witnesses to centuries of migration, storms and recoveries. Inside, the camp settles into rest once more. You realise that surviving winter here was not only a technical achievement, but also a philosophical one grounded in acceptance of vast natural cycles. And as you sit beneath that immense canopy of light, you understand how belief like clothing or shelter formed another layer of resilience against the cold. With morning comes the familiar routine of checking tools, and you begin to notice how even the smallest objects are shaped by winter conditions. Nothing here is designed without considering what it feels like to use it while wearing thick gloves or with fingers numbed by cold. A knife handle is wider than you might expect, allowing a firm grip without precise finger control. Wooden ladles have elongated shafts so hands can stay farther from steam or icy surfaces. Rope loops are tied large enough to grasp easily through layers of felt and fur. Material culture studies of nomadic societies often emphasize this principle of usability in harsh environments. Tools were not only durable but intentionally simple to manipulate when dexterity was limited. A complicated mechanism would fail quickly in freezing weather. You pick up a small hammer used for adjusting harness fittings. Its head is modest, but the handle is wrapped in leather to prevent skin from sticking to cold metal. This detail might seem minor, yet in severe temperatures exposed metal can draw heat away instantly, risking injury. Historical records from the Mongol period note that equipment used by riders followed similar logic. Rein stirrups and weapon grips were adapted for gloved use, ensuring control even during long winter rides. Some historians suggest that this ergonomic awareness contributed to Mongol effectiveness in diverse climates, since their gear already accounted for environmental stress. Others argue that such features were practical necessities rather than deliberate innovations. Whether planned or intuitive, they proved effective. Near the doorway you see wooden pegs rather than metal ones securing parts of the gear. Wood does not become as brittle in the cold, nor does it conduct heat away as rapidly when handled. The choice of material reduces both breakage and discomfort. A lesser-known detail described by travellers mentions that steppe craftsmen often tested tools outdoors immediately after making them, ensuring they functioned properly in real conditions before being trusted for daily use. You try tying a knot with a thick rope yourself and quickly understand why its fibres are coarse and substantial. Fine cord might look elegant, but it would be impossible to manage with gloved hands. Here reliability always outweighs refinement. Inside, the gear containers are shaped with broad openings, so frozen contents can be removed without delicate scraping. Even storage design reflects an understanding of winter limitations. Anthropologists sometimes describe this approach as climate-responsive craftsmanship, though some scholars caution that such labels risk sounding modern. For those who made these objects, adaptation was simply common sense learned through repetition. Mainstream historical research shows that Mongol mobility depended heavily on gear that could be repaired quickly in the field. Tools had to be multifunctional, since carrying unnecessary weight reduced travel efficiency. You notice how often repairs happen immediately rather than postponed. A strap slightly worn is reinforced at once. A cracked wooden piece is replaced before it fails entirely. Preventative maintenance prevents exposure to cold during unexpected breakdowns. Another anecdote recorded in early accounts tells of visitors struggling to handle everyday objects while bundled in heavy clothing, only to realise that local design solved problems they had not anticipated. You set the hammer back where you found it and flex your hands, appreciating how thoughtfully everything has been arranged to minimise strain. Outside, a rider prepares an equipment for a short journey, checking each buckle and loop with deliberate care. These gestures may seem small, yet they ensure that even in freezing winds, every action can be performed smoothly. You begin to understand that survival here depends not only on grand strategies like migration or diet, but also on countless subtle adjustments to the physical world. Every tool becomes an extension of winter knowledge, and as you watch the camp move through its tasks with quiet confidence, you see how design itself becomes a form of protection, shaping objects that cooperate with cold rather than resisting it. Not every winter you learn is predictable. Most seasons follow patterns that experience can manage, but occasionally the steppe delivers conditions so severe that even the most prepared communities are tested. These events are known today by the Mongolian term dzud, a cycle of extreme weather that can combine deep snow ice crusts and sudden temperature plunges. During a dzud, grazing becomes nearly impossible. Snow may harden into a thick layer of ice that animals cannot break through, cutting them off from the grass beneath. Without access to forage, herds weaken quickly, and the delicate balance between humans, animals, and land is strained. Historical records from various periods mention devastating winters that caused widespread livestock loss across the region. Modern climate research confirms that such events have occurred repeatedly over centuries, sometimes reshaping local populations and migration routes. You imagine standing here during one of those years when the familiar strategies you've seen might not be enough on their own. Some historians argue that dzud events played a significant role in prompting large-scale movements of people, possibly even influencing moments of expansion when communities sought better conditions elsewhere. Others caution against drawing direct connections between climate disasters and historical migrations, noting that political and social factors were equally important. The relationship remains debated. Inside the GIR, people speak of such winters with a tone of respect rather than fear. Preparations you have already observed, such as preserving extra food and maintaining mobility, are partly meant to guard against these rare but dangerous seasons. A lesser-known historical anecdote tells of herders who were breaking ice manually with tools to create small feeding areas for animals, working for hours in brutal cold to keep herds alive. Efforts like this required cooperation across families, reinforcing the communal resilience you have witnessed. You step outside and notice how even in an ordinary winter contingency plans remain present. Supplies are never allowed to run too low. Routes remain flexible. Knowledge of distant pastures is preserved in memory just in case. Mainstream historical scholarship often emphasizes that while nomadic systems were highly adaptive, they were not invulnerable. Environmental shocks could still bring hardship, reminding us that survival was always negotiated rather than guaranteed. The wind picks up briefly, carrying loose snow across the ground in thin ribbons. It is easy to imagine how much harsher it could become. Anthropologists studying resilience sometimes describe steppe societies as practicing risk distribution, spreading animals across areas and maintaining social ties to reduce the chance of total loss. Others argue that this interpretation reflects modern analytical frameworks more than historical intention. Yet the strategies themselves remain evident. Inside again, the fire continues its steady burn, a symbol of continuity even in uncertain times. Conversations include quiet recollections of difficult years, shared not to dwell on hardship but to pass along lessons learned. You realise that the success of Mongol winter survival lay partly in acknowledging that failure was possible, planning for extreme created systems flexible enough to recover. Another historical note describes neighbouring settled populations occasionally sending aid or engaging in exchange during especially harsh winters, illustrating how interconnected different societies could become when facing environmental stress. The camp resumes its rhythm, calm but alert, carrying forward practices shaped by both ordinary seasons and extraordinary ones. And as you sit near the warmth, again, you understand that resilience here is not about eliminating risk, but about preparing to meet it with knowledge, cooperation, and the ability to adapt when the steppe turns unexpectedly severe. As winter gradually stretches towards its later weeks, you begin to see how knowledge is carried forward not through written manuals or formal instruction, but through repetition so consistent that it becomes part of daily rhythm. Every action you have watched is also a lesson being quietly passed to the next generation. A young herder helps dismantle a small storage rack and rebuild it nearby, guided only by observation and a few spoken corrections. No diagrams are needed. The process itself is the teaching. Historians studying nomadic cultures often emphasize the importance of oral transmission, where memory and demonstration replaced written records. Skills such as selecting winter camp locations, judging animal health, or layering. Felt coverings were learned by doing them alongside elders year after year. Some scholars suggest this method created a particularly durable form of knowledge since it was embedded in habit rather than dependent on text that could be lost. Others argue that oral systems could also change subtly over time, making it difficult to trace exactly how practices evolved. The balance between preservation and adaptation remains an open question. You notice how corrections are gentle, rarely delivered as commands. Instead, an experienced hand simply repeats the motion slowly until the learner mirrors it. Patience is part of the method. Inside the gear, stories told during earlier evenings now reveal another purpose. They contain references to past winter's migrations and decisions functioning almost like case studies woven into narrative. Listeners absorb practical information without separating it from cultural memory. A fascinating detail recorded by ethnographers notes that certain proverbs referred specifically to seasonal behaviour, reminding people when to conserve fuel, when to move herds, or when to expect sudden cold. These sayings acted as compact reminders of accumulated experience. You step outside and see children practicing how to secure ropes against the wind, their small hands repeating motions they will perform thousands of times in adulthood. The learning feels gradual, yet it is relentless in its consistency. Mainstream historical research indicates that this continuity allowed Mongol society to maintain stable lifeways even as political structures changed dramatically over centuries. Empires rose and fell, but daily survival knowledge persisted. Anthropologists sometimes describe this process as cultural memory encoded in action rather than language. Others caution that such phrasing risks sounding abstract when what we see are simply people teaching one another through shared work. Still, the effectiveness of this method is unmistakable. Another anecdote from early observers recounts how outsiders attempting to learn these skills often struggled, because they expected formal explanations while locals relied on demonstration and repetition. Understanding came through participation, not instruction. You begin to realize that winter itself serves as a teacher. Each season reinforces what must be remembered testing whether lessons were truly learned. The gear remains warm, the fire steady, the routines familiar. Nothing feels hurried yet, nothing is accidental either. Knowledge flows continuously through motion, conversation and example, as the light lengthens slightly each day, hinting that spring will eventually return. Preparations already begin for that transition. Equipment is checked, animals observed closely, routes reconsidered. The cycle continues without pause. And as you watch these quiet exchanges of skill and understanding, you see how survival on the Mongolian steppe depended not just on individual toughness, but on the careful handing down of experience one winter to the next. By now, the patterns of this winter world feel familiar to you. The cold still exists, sharp and undeniable, yet it no longer seems like an overwhelming force. Instead, it has become part of a larger system of living that balances movement, knowledge, cooperation and respect for the land. You wake to another pale morning, noticing how naturally each task unfolds. Someone checks the herd, another tends the stove, a child carries in packed snow for melting. These actions are neither extraordinary nor dramatic. They are the quiet mechanisms through which endurance is built day after day. Historians widely recognize that this way of life shaped Mongol identity as deeply as any political achievement. Long before their empire connected continents, communities on the steppe had already mastered a form of resilience grounded in adaptability. Winter was not an interruption. It was one of the central experiences around which culture itself formed. You step outside and see the vast horizon glowing faintly under the low sun. Nothing about the landscape has softened, yet you understand it differently now. Survival here was never about defeating the cold. It was about designing a life that could continue within it. Some scholars argue that this environmental mastery explains the confidence Mongol societies displayed when expanding into new regions, carrying their mobile systems with them. Others suggest that identity emerged from many influences beyond climate alone. The question of how deeply winter shaped historical development is still discussed. You watch the horses moving steadily through the snow, their breath rising like small clouds. They are as much a part of this story as the people. Without them, mobility would vanish. Without mobility, adaptation would falter. A small historical detail comes to mind, recorded by travellers who remarked that steppe communities seemed to measure wealth not in objects but in animals and relationships. Such wealth could move, endure and recover after hardship. It was a form of security suited perfectly to this environment. Inside, the gear preparations continue with the same calm efficiency you have seen from the beginning. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is rushed. Every motion reflects generations of refinement. Anthropologists often describe nomadic resilience as dynamic rather than static, a process of continual adjustment. Others caution that this language can sound overly technical when the reality is simply people doing what works. Either way, the result is unmistakable. Life persists season after season. You sit near the fire once more, feeling its steady warmth, aware now of how many different elements contribute to this single comfort. The felt walls, the stored fuel, the preserved food, the shared presence of others. The knowledge carried forward from winters long past. Outside, the wind crosses the open steppe just as it always has, indifferent to human plans. Yet within this small circle of shelter, it no longer feels like an adversary. It is simply part of the world these people have learned to inhabit. And as the day slowly fades into evening, you sense how endurance here is not loud or heroic. It is patient, repetitive, grounded in habits so reliable they transform even the harshest season into something livable. The fire settles into a soft glow. Conversations grow quieter. The vast cold remains outside, but inside there is balance. Now as you rest in that warmth, the rhythm of the steppe begins to slow even further. Movements become unhurried, sounds soften. The long winter that once felt intimidating now seems almost gentle in its predictability. You imagine the generations who have sat in spaces like this, listening to the same wind, tending the same kind of fire, trusting the same patterns. Each winter came and went, leaving behind not defeat but continuity. Your breathing matches the calm around you. The gyre holds its steady heat. Beyond its walls, the stars emerge again, silent and constant above the open land. There is nothing more you need to do. The systems are in place, the knowledge endures. Winter passes as it always has, one quiet night at a time. Sweet dream.